Story number 1.
The house at the end of Millbrook Lane had stood vacant for nearly a decade. Its weathered facade and cracked windows gave it an air of abandonment, though it wasn't derelict enough to scare off potential buyers forever. When Lydia found it listed for a price far below market value, she couldn't resist. It was her chance to own a home, something she hadn't thought possible as a single woman in her late 20s, scraping by as a freelance writer. "I can fix it up," she told herself during the walkthrough. The house was drafty, and the wooden floors creaked with every step, but it had potential. The living room was spacious, with a stone fireplace as its centerpiece, and the upstairs master bedroom had a window seat that overlooked the sprawling backyard. She envisioned long nights curled up with a book, the room lit by the glow of a small lamp. The real estate agent had been vague about the house's history. "It's old," he said when Lydia asked. "Built in the early 1900s. The previous owners left it in decent shape, but, well, they moved away unexpectedly." Lydia had shrugged it off. People moved all the time, and the price was too good to pass up. By the time she moved in, the house felt more like hers. She had painted the walls in soft, inviting colors and filled the space with secondhand furniture that gave the place a cozy charm. There was still work to be done. The basement smelled of mildew and the windows needed sealing, but she was proud of what she'd accomplished. The house no longer looked abandoned, but something about the nights felt different. The first few nights were uneventful. Lydia slept deeply, the exhaustion of moving outweighing any jitters about being alone in a creaky old house. But by the end of the first week, she began waking up at odd hours, her sleep disrupted by sounds she couldn't quite place. At first, it was subtle, a faint tapping noise like fingers brushing against the glass of her bedroom window. She told herself it was the wind or the branches of the tree outside. Then came the footsteps. It started one night around 3 a.m. Lydia woke with a jolt, her heart racing, unsure of what had disturbed her. She lay in bed, her ears straining against the silence. Then she heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps, moving across the floorboards in the hallway outside her bedroom. The sound was so clear, so distinct, that it sent a chill down her spine. "Probably the house settling," she whispered to herself, though she didn't entirely believe it. Clutching the blanket tighter around her, she stayed frozen in place, too afraid to investigate. The footsteps stopped after a few moments, and the house returned to silence. The next morning, she laughed at herself for being so jumpy. "Old houses make noise," she said aloud, as if speaking the words would make them true. But deep down, a seed of unease had been planted. Over the following weeks, the disturbances grew more frequent. The footsteps came almost every night, sometimes pacing back and forth in the hallway, sometimes stopping just outside her bedroom door. On one occasion, Lydia worked up the courage to fling the door open, her flashlight clutched tightly in her hand. The hallway was empty. The tapping on her window also returned, growing more persistent. One night, as she lay awake, listening to the rhythmic sound, she pulled the curtain aside, expecting to see a branch swaying in the wind. But there was nothing. No tree close enough to the house to account for the noise. The realization sent a shiver through her, and she let the curtain fall back into place. Lydia tried to rationalize the events, but it was becoming harder to explain them away. She began leaving lights on at night, hoping the warm glow would make the house feel less ominous. But the light didn't stop the noises, and it didn't stop the feeling. The feeling was the worst part. It was hard to describe, an oppressive sensation that settled over her whenever she was alone in the house. It wasn't constant, but when it came, it was overwhelming. She would feel it most acutely at night, lying in bed, the darkness pressing in around her. It was as if someone was watching her, their presence heavy and suffocating. One evening, Lydia invited her friend Clara over for dinner, hoping the company would lift her spirits. As they sat at the dining table, drinking wine and laughing, Lydia almost forgot about the strange happenings. But halfway through the evening, Clara paused mid-sentence, her expression turning serious. "Did you hear that?" she asked, tilting her head toward the hallway. "Hear what?" Lydia replied, her stomach tightening. "It sounded like someone walking. Is someone else here?" Lydia forced a laugh, though her voice wavered. "No, it's just the house. It makes noises sometimes." Clara frowned but didn't press the issue. Still, Lydia couldn't shake the uneasy look on her friend's face. After Clara left, the house felt emptier than ever, the silence almost deafening. That night, the footsteps were louder than they had ever been. Lydia woke to the sound of something dragging across the floor. It wasn't in the hallway this time, it was in her bedroom. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared into the darkness, her eyes slowly adjusting. She could just make out the outline of her dresser, but nothing seemed out of place. Then the dragging sound came again, closer this time, followed by a soft, raspy whisper. Lydia's blood ran cold as she realized the sound was coming from the foot of her bed. She reached for her phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating, nothing. The room was empty, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, and it took all of her strength to keep from fleeing the house right then and there. The next morning, Lydia called a local historian, desperate to learn more about the house. The woman she spoke to was kind but hesitant. "That house has a reputation," she said after a long pause. "The family who lived there before you left in a hurry. They never said why, but there were rumors, stories about the original owners." Lydia's heart sank. What kind of stories? The historian hesitated. The house was built by a man named Arthur Greaves in the early 1900s. He lived there with his wife and young daughter. Tragedy struck not long after they moved in. His wife died suddenly, and his daughter disappeared. Some people say she ran away, but others believe, well, let's just say the house has seen its share of sorrow. Lydia thanked the woman and hung up, her mind racing. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but they only left her with more questions. Who or what was in the house with her? And what did it want? That night, Lydia made a decision. She couldn't live like this anymore. She packed a bag and planned to stay with Clara until she figured out what to do next. But as she was leaving, the feeling returned. It was stronger than ever, an overwhelming sense of dread that made her skin crawl. She froze in the doorway, her breath coming in shallow gasps, and then she heard it, a voice, soft and plaintive, coming from the hallway behind her. "Don't leave." Lydia didn't wait to see who or what had spoken. She bolted out the door, her bag swinging wildly at her side. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, the house looming behind her like a dark, malevolent shadow. Lydia never returned to the house. She sold it as quickly as she could, barely caring about the financial loss. But even now, in the quiet of the night, she sometimes hears the footsteps, faint and distant, as if they're following her wherever she goes. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The rain had started just as Elena slid into bed, a steady drizzle that drummed against the windows of her small cottage. She had always loved the sound of rain, finding it soothing and perfect for falling asleep. But tonight, as she lay alone in her bed, the rain felt different. The steady rhythm seemed to amplify the silence inside the house, making her acutely aware of every creak, groan, and rustle. It was her second night in the cottage, a rental she had taken on the outskirts of town to escape the chaos of city life. The place was charming, if a little old, with its worn wooden floors and slightly crooked door frames. When she first moved in, she joked to herself that it felt like the kind of place that might be haunted. But now, the joke didn't seem so funny. Elena pulled the blanket up to her chin and closed her eyes, determined to sleep despite her unease. The day had been long, filled with unpacking and organizing, and her body ached with exhaustion. But as the minutes dragged on, sleep wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself wide awake, her ears straining against the stillness. Then she heard it. A faint scratching sound, so soft she thought she might have imagined it. It came from the far corner of the room, near the window. Elena opened her eyes, her breath catching in her throat. She stayed perfectly still, listening. The sound came again. Louder this time, a deliberate scrape against the wood. Telling herself it was probably a branch brushing against the house, she forced herself to relax. "Just the wind," she whispered aloud, as if saying it would make it true. But the scratching stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence. Moments later, there was a creak, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the floor toward her bed. Elena froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound was too clear, too precise to be her imagination. It didn't sound like the old house settling. It sounded like someone, or something, was in the room with her. "Hello?" she called out, her voice shaking. The footsteps stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of the rain tapping against the window. She reached for her phone on the nightstand, fumbling with trembling hands to turn on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing. The room was empty. Elena let out a shaky breath, laughing nervously at herself. "Get a grip," she muttered, turning off the flashlight and setting the phone back down. She tried to convince herself that it had been her imagination, her mind playing tricks on her in the unfamiliar surroundings. But deep down, she didn't believe it. She lay back down, pulling the blanket tightly around her. She tried to focus on the rain, letting its steady rhythm lull her back into a sense of calm. Minutes passed, and just as her body began to relax, the sound returned. This time, it was louder, a low, guttural whisper, barely audible over the rain. Elena couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, accusing. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, filling the room with an oppressive weight. Panicked, she sat up and turned on the lamp beside her bed. The light flickered for a moment before steadying, casting long shadows across the room. She scanned every corner, her eyes darting between the furniture and the darkened window. Nothing. There was no one there. The whispering stopped. Elena stayed awake for the rest of the night, her back pressed against the headboard, the lamp on and her phone clutched tightly in her hand. When dawn finally broke, she felt a wave of relief, though her exhaustion was palpable. The morning light seemed to chase away the fear, making the night's events feel distant and surreal. But that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows crept back into the cottage, the unease returned. Elena found herself dreading bedtime, reluctant to turn off the lights. She told herself she was being ridiculous, that she couldn't let her imagination get the better of her. Still, she left the lamp on as she climbed into bed. The hours ticked by, and though her body ached for rest, sleep refused to come. The rain had stopped, leaving the night eerily quiet. Every sound seemed magnified. The ticking of the clock on the wall, the rustle of the wind outside, the faint creaks of the old house. And then, just as she began to drift off, she heard the footsteps again. This time, they were closer, heavier, as if whatever was making them had gained confidence. The sound echoed through the room, sending a chill down Elena's spine. She didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe as the footsteps stopped just beside her bed. A cold, unnatural stillness filled the air, and then she felt it, a light tug on the edge of her blanket, as though someone was trying to pull it away from her. Her heart raced as she clutched the fabric tightly, refusing to let go. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The only response was a low, guttural laugh, soft and chilling, coming from just inches away. Elena screamed, bolting upright and scrambling out of bed. She grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, the beam of light shaking as her hands trembled. The room was empty. The blanket lay perfectly still on the bed as if nothing had happened. But the air felt heavy, charged with an energy that made her skin crawl. Elena didn't hesitate. She grabbed her keys, threw on a coat, and fled the cottage without looking back. She spent the night in her car, parked in a brightly lit lot near the center of town. When the morning came, she called the landlord and told him she was leaving. She didn't bother explaining why. He didn't seem surprised. "You're not the first to leave early," he said after a long pause. "That place, it has its stories." Elena didn't ask for details. She didn't want to know. All she cared about was getting away, putting as much distance as possible between herself and the cottage. But no matter how far she went, she couldn't escape the memories. On quiet nights, when the world is still and sleep won't come, she sometimes hears it. The soft, deliberate footsteps and the faint sound of a whisper that she will never forget. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The house was unassuming, a plain two-story structure that sat at the edge of a small New England town. Its gray siding blended into the overcast sky, and its cracked driveway seemed to beckon to someone like Rachel, someone looking for a fresh start, someone desperate enough to overlook the creeping sense of unease that clung to the place. Rachel had moved in alone. After a bitter breakup and the death of her mother within the same year, she needed solitude, a place to rebuild herself. The house had been cheap, suspiciously so, but the realtor chalked it up to the property's age and the fact that it had sat empty for years. Rachel didn't press for details. It was affordable, isolated, and just what she thought she needed. The first few days were uneventful. Rachel busied herself unpacking, organizing, and finding little projects to make the house feel like home. But as night fell, the house seemed to change. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just small things. A creak in the floorboards upstairs when she knew she was alone downstairs. A flicker in the hallway light that no amount of bulb tightening could fix. By the end of the first week, Rachel noticed the cold. No matter how high she set the thermostat, the house refused to warm up entirely, especially in the evenings. She'd wrap herself in blankets on the couch, her breath visible in the air, despite the furnace humming softly in the background. One night, as she lay in bed, she heard it for the first time, a faint whisper, like someone breathing words into her ear. Her eyes flew open and she turned her head toward the open door of her bedroom. The hallway was dark, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was standing there, just out of sight. "Just my imagination," she muttered, pulling the blanket over her head. But the whisper didn't stop. It was soft and fragmented, the words impossible to understand. The next morning, she blamed it on stress. A new house, the loneliness of being in a strange town, it was enough to make anyone's mind play tricks on them. She made coffee, played music loudly, and convinced herself it was all in her head. But the house wouldn't let her forget. A few nights later, she woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Her heart pounded as she sat up in bed, straining to hear. The sound was faint but deliberate, as though someone was pacing back and forth just outside her door. She clutched her phone tightly, its flashlight casting a weak beam into the darkness. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was so heavy, so oppressive, that she felt like she couldn't breathe. Rachel forced herself to investigate, her hands shaking as she opened the bedroom door. The hallway was empty, but the feeling of being watched was so intense that she couldn't bear to stay there. She retreated to her room and locked the door, her heart racing. The disturbances became more frequent after that. She'd find the lights in the kitchen on when she was sure she'd turned them off. The radio in the living room would switch on by itself, static, crackling loudly in the dead of night. The whispers grew louder, their fragmented words more insistent, though she could never make out exactly what they were saying. One evening, as she was brushing her teeth, she caught something in the mirror that made her blood run cold. For a brief moment, she saw a shadowy figure standing behind her, its face obscured, but its presence unmistakable. She spun around, her heart hammering in her chest, but the bathroom was empty. Rachel tried to rationalize it. She told herself it was stress, exhaustion, the power of suggestion. But deep down, she knew better. Desperate for answers, she started researching the house's history. She discovered that it had been built in the early 1900s and had passed through several owners over the decades. The most chilling discovery came when she stumbled upon an old newspaper article. The house's last long-term resident, a man named Thomas Reed, had disappeared without a trace 20 years earlier. His wife and daughter had died in the house years before his disappearance, both under mysterious circumstances. Rachel's stomach turned as she read the details. The wife had fallen down the stairs in what was ruled an accidental death, though neighbors had whispered about bruises that didn't quite match the story. The daughter had been found lifeless in her bed, her cause of death never determined. After Thomas disappeared, the house had remained empty, changing hands occasionally, but never occupied for long. The article ended with a chilling quote from one of the neighbors. "That house doesn't want people. It spits them out." Rachel closed her laptop, her hands shaking. The air around her felt heavier, colder, as if the house itself knew she was uncovering its secrets. That night, she decided she couldn't stay. She packed a bag, planning to leave first thing in the morning. But as she lay in bed, the whispers returned, louder than ever. This time the words were clear. "Don't go." Rachel froze, her body trembling. The voice wasn't just in her head. It was real, audible, coming from the corner of her room. She turned her head slowly, her eyes wide with terror. In the dim light from the street lamp outside, she saw it. A figure, barely more than a shadow, standing in the corner. Its outline flickered like static on a television, but its presence was undeniable. "Why are you here?" she whispered, her voice shaking. The figure didn't respond, but she felt it move closer, the air growing colder with every passing second. Her breath came in shallow gasps as the figure loomed over her, its face inches from hers. "You don't belong here," it rasped, the voice low and guttural. "Leave." Rachel didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed her bag and fled the house, not even bothering to lock the door behind her. She drove aimlessly through the night, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She never went back. Rachel found a small apartment in the city, far from the house and its dark history. She sold the property at a loss, not caring about the financial hit. But even now, years later, she can't shake the feeling that she's being watched. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she hears faint whispers, as if the house hasn't entirely let her go. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The house had a strange way of settling into darkness. Not like most places, where shadows deepen gradually and the light dims softly. No, this house seemed to swallow daylight the moment the sun began its descent, leaving the air thick with shadows as if something unseen had been waiting for the cover of night. Marisa wasn't the kind of person who scared easily. She prided herself on her rationality, her refusal to indulge in things she deemed childish or superstitious. But her first night in the old house had left her uneasy, though she tried not to admit it to herself. The move had been a practical one. She'd needed a change of scenery after her divorce, a place where she could start fresh. The house was cheap, nestled on the edge of a quiet town, with neighbors far enough apart to give her space, but close enough to feel a sense of safety. It was old, yes, with creaky wooden floors and drafty windows, but it had charm. At least that's what she told herself. By the end of the first week, the charm was wearing thin. Small things started to bother her. The way the air seemed colder in certain parts of the house, even when the heat was on. The faint creaking of floorboards in the middle of the night, as if someone was walking down the hall. She dismissed it as the quirks of an old house, the kind of noises that came with aging wood and shifting foundations. But it wasn't just the noises. It was the feeling. Marisa noticed it most acutely when she was lying in bed at night, the house quiet and still around her. It was a heavy sensation, like the air was pressing down on her, making it harder to breathe. She tried to ignore it, but the unease grew stronger with each passing night. One evening, as she sat on the couch sipping a glass of wine and flipping through an old photo album, she heard it for the first time, a faint whisper, just at the edge of her hearing. It was so soft she thought she might have imagined it. She froze, straining her ears, but the sound didn't come again. "Just the wind," she muttered, shaking her head. But even as she said it, a shiver ran down her spine. The next night, she heard it again. This time, she was lying in bed, the house dark and silent around her. The whisper was faint, almost like a breeze moving through the room, but the words were indecipherable. Her eyes darted to the open doorway of her bedroom, the hallway beyond cloaked in darkness. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. There was no response, only the oppressive silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Marisa told herself it was her imagination, the stress of the move, the loneliness of being in a new place. It was all just playing tricks on her mind. But as the days turned into weeks, the stranger came harder to ignore. One night, she woke to the sound of footsteps outside her bedroom door. Her heart raced as she sat up in bed, her ears straining to hear. The sound was faint, but deliberate. Soft, shuffling steps, as if someone was pacing back and forth in the hallway. Gripping her phone tightly, Marisa turned on the flashlight and swung her legs out of bed. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty hallway. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she stepped out of the room, her bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor. "Is someone there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The house didn't answer. She checked every room, every closet, even the locked basement door, but there was no one. Marisa tried to convince herself it was just the house settling, but deep down she knew that wasn't true. The days passed in a blur, her nerves fraying with each sleepless night. She stopped inviting friends over, embarrassed to explain why she always seemed so distracted. Even the thought of leaving the house after dark filled her with dread. The turning point came on a stormy night in late October. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and sending leaves skittering across the porch. Marisa was curled up on the couch, trying to lose herself in a book, when she heard the whisper again. This time, it was louder, more insistent, and it seemed to be coming from the corner of the living room. She froze, her eyes darting toward the sound. The corner was empty, but the whisper continued, growing louder and clearer with each passing second. Her chest tightened as she finally made out the words, "Get out!" Marisa bolted upright, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The whisper stopped abruptly, leaving the room deathly silent. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, her heart pounding in her chest. When the whisper didn't return, she grabbed her keys and fled the house, driving aimlessly through the empty streets until dawn. She spent the next day at a coffee shop, just trying to convince herself she wasn't losing her mind. But the worst was yet to come. A few nights later, Marisa woke to the feeling of someone sitting on the edge of her bed. Her eyes flew open, and she turned her head slowly, dread pooling in her stomach. In the dim light, she could make out the faint impression of a figure, a shadowy silhouette that seemed to dissolve into the darkness around it. The figure didn't move, but she felt its presence like a weight in the air, heavy and suffocating. Her throat tightened as she tried to speak, but no sound came out. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body wouldn't obey her. All she could do was lie there, paralyzed with fear. The shadow finally shifted, its form growing darker, more solid. It leaned closer, and she felt a cold breath against her cheek. The words it spoke were barely audible, but they cut through her like a knife. "You shouldn't have come." The figure vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving Marisa gasping for air. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what had happened. The next morning, she called a local historian, hoping to learn more about the house's history. The woman she spoke to was hesitant at first, but eventually she shared the story. The house had belonged to a reclusive man named Edward Langley, who had lived there alone for decades. He was rumored to be an eccentric, a man obsessed with the occult. Neighbors had reported strange noises and lights coming from the house late at night, but no one had dared confront him. When Langley died in the 1940s, the house had remained vacant for years, its eerie reputation keeping buyers away. Marisa listened in stunned silence, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. She thanked the historian and hung up, her hands trembling. She knew she couldn't stay in the house any longer. That night, as she packed her belongings, the whispering returned. It followed her from room to room, growing louder and more frantic as she neared the front door. "You can't leave," the voice hissed, sending chills down her spine. But Marisa didn't stop. She grabbed her bags and ran out of the house, slamming the door behind her. She never looked back. Marisa moved into a small apartment in the city, leaving the house and its dark history behind. But sometimes, in the stillness of the night, she swears she can still hear it. A faint whisper, carried on the wind, reminding her of the place she'll never forget. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The night was cold, colder than it had been all week. Clara lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her body wrapped tightly in a cocoon of blankets. She had been exhausted all day, yet as soon as she climbed into bed, sleep eluded her. The quiet hum of the heater in her small apartment was the only sound, a faint reminder that she was utterly alone. It was her first night living there. The apartment was a tiny studio on the edge of town, just within her budget. Clara had been excited about moving in, eager for the independence she had always craved. But as the hours ticked by, her excitement had faded, replaced by a creeping unease. At first, she thought it was just her nerves. Moving into a new place was always an adjustment. But the longer she lay there, the more it began to feel like something wasn't quite right. She couldn't pinpoint what it was. A strange energy, maybe, or the subtle sensation that she wasn't as alone as she thought. Brushing off the feeling, Clara turned onto her side and closed her eyes, determined to get some rest. Her mind began to drift, and she felt herself sinking into the edges of sleep. That's when she heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Clara's eyes snapped open, her heart pounding. She held her breath, listening intently. The sound was faint but distinct, coming from the corner of the room. Tap, tap, tap. It was too deliberate to be random. She sat up, her eyes scanning the darkened room. Nothing looked out of place. The corner where the sound had come from was empty, just a small table and chair she'd found at a thrift store. Telling herself it was probably just the building settling, she lay back down, trying to calm her racing thoughts. Minutes passed in silence, and she began to relax again. But just as her breathing evened out, the sound returned. Louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. It echoed through the room, sending a shiver down her spine. Clara turned on her bedside lamp, flooding the room with warm light. "Hello?" she called, her voice barely above a whisper. There was no response. She got out of bed, her bare feet touching the cold, hardwood floor, and slowly walked toward the corner. The tapping stopped the moment she approached. She stared at the table and chair, searching for any logical explanation. Maybe the heater had knocked something loose, or perhaps the sound had come from the apartment above hers. Feeling foolish, she went back to bed, leaving the lamp on this time. Hours passed, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt that strange sensation again, the inexplicable feeling of being watched. She pulled the blankets tighter around her, telling herself she was imagining things. Then came the creak of floorboards. Clara froze, her body stiffening. The sound was unmistakable, a soft groan, as if someone was walking across the room. Slowly, she turned her head toward the source of the noise. The corner was still empty, but the chair had moved. It was subtle, just a few inches closer to the bed than it had been before. Clara's chest tightened as her mind raced. She hadn't touched the chair. She was sure of it. A wave of fear washed over her, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Is someone there?" she asked, her voice trembling. The words hung in the air, unanswered. She reached for her phone, clutching it tightly as if it were a lifeline. The clock read 3:17 a.m. Her fingers hovered over the call button, but she hesitated. What would she say? That her chair had moved on its own? That she felt like something was in the room with her? No one would believe her. The apartment fell silent again, but Clara couldn't shake the oppressive feeling of dread. She lay awake, her eyes fixed on the chair, daring it to move again. Hours passed, and eventually exhaustion overtook her. She drifted into a restless sleep, the lamp still glowing beside her. When she woke, the sun was streaming through the blinds. The apartment felt different in the daylight, smaller, safer, and undeniably empty. She laughed nervously at herself, shaking her head. "Just my imagination," she muttered, trying to brush off the events of the night before. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. Clara cleaned, unpacked a few more boxes, and even called her best friend to share the eerie story, though she downplayed how scared she'd been. By the time night fell, she convinced herself that everything would be fine. But as she lay in bed that night, the familiar unease returned. She turned off the lamp and closed her eyes, willing herself to sleep. The silence pressed down on her, thick and suffocating. Then, just as the night before, the tapping began. Clara's eyes shot open, her pulse quickening. She didn't move this time, didn't call out. She simply lay there, staring at the corner, her body paralyzed with fear. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was causing it was trying to get her attention. And then it stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Clara let out a shaky breath, her muscles trembling. But the relief was short-lived. From the darkness, she heard a voice, soft, barely more than a whisper. "Why are you in my room?" The words sent a jolt of terror through her. Clara sat up, fumbling for the lamp, but the bulb flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The voice came again, closer this time. "You don't belong here." Clara scrambled out of bed, her hands shaking as she grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing the room exactly as it should be. The table, the chair, her scattered belongings. Everything was in its place, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Heart pounding, Clara grabbed her keys and bolted for the door. She didn't stop until she was outside, the cool night air stinging her skin. She climbed into her car and drove away, not caring where she went as long as it was far from the apartment. She never returned. When she called the landlord the next day, she didn't bother explaining why she couldn't stay. The man didn't seem surprised, though. "You're not the first," he said quietly. "That place, it has a history." Clara didn't ask for details. She didn't want to know. All she cared about was finding somewhere new, somewhere safe, somewhere she could finally sleep without fear. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when the world is quiet, she still hears it. The soft, rhythmic tapping and the faint whisper of a voice that refuses to let her forget. Story the end.